Hey there, welcome to my feral quote-unquote guide. This is not a rotational guide. You should know how to play the spec in general before watching this video. This is also not a generic Fyrakk guide. This is for feral min-maxing and tips that I've learned throughout the course of my polls. This is not applicable to other specs for probably over 90% of the items I'm about to talk about. I'll be talking about all of the min-max aspects that I've learned over the course of 300 polls, and things that I think that all Druids should employ to either do more damage or help with progression overall with their toolkit. I'd also like to add a disclaimer here that I am not a Feral main. I'm a Moonkin main that played Feral in the last two bosses, but I was able to perform very well by adapting certain tips over the course of the 300 polls on Fyrakk. All right, first thing I want to touch on is Embellish, because the common Embellish for Feral Druid is double blue silken lining. However, on Fyrakk, that is not actually the case. So, if we look at the most common embellishes present up here at the top, we'll see that Toxic Thorn plus a question mark, which is equivalent to the Toxic Patch because it's not a physical item, equate to 58% of the total Feral Druid parses, at least in the top 100. And there's a good reason for that. So blue silken lining suffers a problem on fights with high damage intake because it is very hard to sustain your health above 90%. You especially saw this if you played Feral on Tindril because there was so much damage that it was really difficult to rationalize running blue silken lining because you were constantly taking damage and you were never above 90% during your cooldowns. Now, the same sort of problem ails Fyrakk, where if we're looking at this log, this is one of the top logs. This is Nature Man, who is rank 2 boss damage, who is running blue silken lining. You can see that his first cooldown at 8 seconds, he will have, so these are his convokes, which is the most important thing to have your blue silken lining uptime for. You can see that his first cast of Convoke is at 8 seconds, but you can see that there's a gap here so that he actually only has blue silken lining for the second half of his Convoke, which is, as you can expect, pretty bad. Here we can see that he has asked his second one in the Intermission at 249. In this case, he actually got a full Convoke in blue silken lining during Intermission, which is incredibly impressive. It's very hard to actually get that. The third usage at 454, you can see that there's a gap down here at a similar location, then he only starts regaining it at 5 minutes. This means his entire Convoke did not have blue silken lining, although he did have it for a pretty sizable amount of his remaining cooldown, or the remaining Berserk. At 735, which is the most important one to have it, this is the Lust Convoke, Lust Berserk cooldown window. You can see that he actually misses because he starts gaining it back. He loses it at 733, gains it back at 738, but he casts at 735. That means he lost about 2 to 3 seconds of his Convoke in the blue silken lining window. That is really bad. Like that hurts the blue silken value a lot. And then if we look at his last one, this is the one you hit at the end of the fight when you are about to have the fourth push or right after the fourth push. 943, you can see that his last instance of Zone of Focus being up is at 937. That means he got 0 value on his Convoke from blue silken lining. This is partly why a lot of people are preferring Toxic Thorn over blue silken lining in this fight. There's just too much damage. That's just simply about it. Next, I want to talk about roar timings. So, in my opinion, it's very important to run 1 minute roar in this fight. There's a lot of timings where you can get 2 roars off, where you would not be able to if you're running 2 minute roar, and both roars have incredibly high value. This is especially the case if you have a low number of shamans and overall druids in the raid. For example, in my raid, there was only 1 druid and 1 shaman, which is me and the enhancement shaman. So there was a large need for just raw speed boosts. Well, Time Spiral is good. It can only do so much, and it does not help classes like Priest and DK that much. So it's important that you have good speeds on good timings. Now, the timings where these are good, in my opinion, is there's 2 of them in P1. The first one is right as you're finishing running from Dream Rend 1, basically the final move into like this larger move where you're spreading for Blaze, a roar timing right there on everybody that's all clumped up so they can like zip across the room and also reposition quickly and efficiently when trying to plant for Blazes is super good. And then there's one other timing at the end of P1 where it is the final firestorm drops. These final firestorm drops can get a little bit clusterfucky because there's not much room left and people can kind of second guess themselves. I personally roar here. Some people roar the intermission, the start of the intermission instead. I personally don't think the start of the intermission needs a roar. It seems kind of pointless to me personally. But one of those two roar timings is really good. You can't hit both of them if you have 2-minute roar. And then we are moving into P2, where there are two good roar timings here that I find personally, and they are both blaze sets right before the Colossus spawn. So basically, the boss does the Greater Firestorm. It spawns a ton of blazes, a bunch of swirls everywhere. There's ads spawning. Generally, your raid should be shifted to one side of the room based on position of the ads. And if you can hit a roar on most of the raid to help them reposition to not hit the ads, not hit each other, not get hit by a swirl, it just adds a lot of value and a lot of survivability to the raid. It is super good. You should do this on both Colossus ad sets. You wouldn't be able to do this with 2-minute roar. It is super good. I highly recommend it. And then we move into P3, where there are 3 roars that you'll want to hit if possible. It is the first tornadoes, the third tornadoes, and the final push from the boss's devastating roar, or whatever it's called, where you're soaking with the siege shield. Those 3 timings are super good. They're kind of tight to each other, so it's important that you pre-roar the actual spell. This is especially important that you pre-roar the third tornado, otherwise you will not have roar for the final devastating roar from the boss. Next point that I want to talk about is trinket usage. Your primary on-use trinket should obviously be ashes. Pretty much every feral druid runs it. Witherbark Branch is super clunky to use, despite how it simmed well originally. Not many people end up using it, and everyone pretty much uses ashes. I agree with this, and you should be using ashes as your primary on-use trinket. Now, your second trinket, your passive trinket, should be one of 2 things. One being the Cataclysmic Signet brand. I personally believe this is a must pick if you have it at least heroic eye level, just because with how long the fight goes, this trinket gets a lot of value, and you pretty much are guaranteed to get a lot of damage out of this because you have a lot of time to let the stacks ramp up. And this especially helps in P2 and P3 where the damage actually matters because you have time from P1 and I1 you stack it up for the parts where the boss damage actually sticks, which is P2 and P3. The other option, which is a pretty common one, is Pips. If you have it, this is just a solid flat damage trinket. And if you don't have Cataclysmic brand, this is pretty close. It's especially good on progression where you're not hitting P3 all the time. You're in P1, I1, P2 progression. I recommend using Pips even over Signet brand until you start seeing P3, and then Signet brand becomes really good just because it starts getting a lot of damage when fights go that long. And yeah, ideally you have one of these 2. If you don't have one of these 2, just run it through a sim and then pick whichever one's the highest at that point. Next thing I want to quickly touch on is cooldown timing. Cooldown timing is pretty fixed in this fight. You'll see that the majority of people here follow the same general timings, and those timings are pull, intermission 1, almost as fast as you possibly can in intermission 1 without griefing your dot setup. Immediately after the first Colossus set, so when the boss comes down after you defeat the first Colossus set, you dot him up and send your cooldowns. The 4th usage is during Lust, towards the start of P3 after the first devastating roar. And the final usage is at the very end of the fight, right after the 4th roar, which, depending on when you do the fight, post any nerfs that might happen after the release of this video, you might not even see this cooldown usage. You can see that some of these people that are on farm don't even get their final usage of their cooldown, so you might not get this final one, but otherwise, these cooldown timings are pretty much static. There's almost no reason you should ever change them. Another important general thing to know is that if we change from these and we take a look at potion timings, you'll see that a lot of people follow this delayed potion timer. On progression, I also highly recommend you do this. If you're not on progression, you can potentially swap back to these timings, but for progression purposes and seeing the fight more consistently, I highly recommend you do what these people do. If you also look at my line here, I also do this. It's called a early pot, where you don't pot pull and you early pop the pot going into I1, you want to early pop it like this. So this lasts 30 seconds, so it will still last for the large chunk of your cooldown and the important part of your cooldown, which is Convoke. And this also allows you to get it, as you can see, exactly 5 minutes later, right when Lust happens at about 7:30. So this gets a plot on the important parts of the fight for you as a Feral Druid, which is the I1 shield, because you're a very large portion of the I1 shield damage, as well as at 7:30 in Lust, because your damage in P3, especially if you get the second use of cooldowns towards the end of P3, is incredibly high. It is super good, and having pot for Lust in general is just super powerful. And potting on pull just doesn't matter, because once you get comfortable in P1 after a while, you will be doing holds in P1 to make sure you push during a cast so that you can milk damage. You can pot pull to start progression until you start getting the DPS hold, but I highly recommend switching to the early pot as seen by a number of these people when you can. Next, I want to talk about P1 related items. And to start is something that you can actually do before you even get in the raid, is that when people are assigning the Mythic soak position, so generally people will assign this group of people soak the left, this group of people soak the middle, and this group of people soak the right. If you can get assigned to the right one, it helps your uptime a lot. You don't necessarily need it because you're a Feral Druid, you have one range anyway. But if you have excess like healer and ranged counts, getting assigned to the middle basically guarantees that you never lose uptime during the Mythic soak mechanic. It is just generally a pretty good thing to have if you're able to. Next, I want to talk about abusing Feral's relatively large range during P1 to like keep maximum uptime, because you don't really need to bother with it in P2 and P3. But P1, there's a lot of situations where the boss can move out of your range, or you can kind of abuse your Feral range to get higher uptime in different parts of P1. For example, the first and most obvious one is the first soak of the fight. It's very easy to over move and pre-position yourself instantly when it comes out. But generally, with how the melee spots work and where the boss should be positioned during this cast, it's very easy to actually stay on the boss and get a few casts, and then tire dash out to your spot right before it happens, without losing much uptime at all, and also getting your drop in the correct position. It is very important, however, that if you're going to do this, you pre-position and lean towards where you're going to go, so that everyone else that is trying to pick a spot is aware of where you're going to go and doesn't panic when you go into it last second. Speaking of Feral range, you can actually abuse the large AoE radius of Thrash and Brutal Slash to spend energy and clear casting procs during both Dream Rend casts. Of course, this depends a little bit on how deep the tank pulls the boss into the fire, but especially on Dream Rend 1, it's often pretty easy to be able to hit the boss with AoE abilities. Often stuff like Shred and Rake won't be able to reach, but Thrash and Brutal Slash often are able to reach the boss and allow you to spend excess energy or clear casting procs while you're waiting for the boss to jump back out of the fire to continue your normal rotation. Now, I want to take a quick note about Tiger Dash. Tiger Dash is really, really good on this fight. It is super good at many points in this fight. And one way you can use it in P1 is that you can use it to get a lot of hits on the boss right after the Dream Rend cast. So when it does its initial movement towards the raid, and then be able to Tiger Dash away from the pull-in, because the closer you are to the Dream Rend, the harder it pulls you. So you can use Tiger Dash's extreme boost in movement speed to get out of what otherwise would be an like unresistible pull from the Dream Rend, which would get you killed normally. But instead, you can use Tiger Dash to maintain a good amount of uptime while the boss is being pulled out, as well as keeping yourself out of danger the entire time you do that. And the last little tidbit I want to add about P1 is if you have a series of procs or decisions that result in a situation where one of your core dots, so Rake or Rip primarily, will fall off during a Dream Rend for a notable amount of time, you can actually use Tiger Dash to zip into the fire, apply it with whatever resources you currently have, and then zip back out. The interesting thing about the fire on this fight is that it does not tick you instantly. This means that as long as you're quick enough, you can enter the fire and leave the fire without ever taking damage or only potentially taking 1 tick of damage. This, when you're comfortable in P1, basically means you don't have to worry about losing your dot uptime, and the amount of damage you take from 1 tick of fire is relatively negligible, and for the most part can just be recovered with your own instant regrowth procs that you can cast. Next, I'm going to start talking about I1. There's a few points here, and the first 2 points that I'm going to talk about are something that you can discuss before entering the raid. And the first one is talk to Augs about getting buffed for I1. This isn't just because, oh, I want damage. Straight up, Feral Druid is one of the strongest classes for doing I1 shield damage. Basically, the only class that can beat it is Rogue. So unless you have many rogues in your roster, Feral Druid is an amazing target for getting buffed in I1 and will result in a way easier time for you and your raid breaking through the I1 shield consistently on time, and especially during prog when damage to the I1 shield can be a little bit sketchy. Next is talking to the raid leader or whoever works with ERT, MRT notes, and make sure that for whatever weak aura that you use for I1 orb positioning assignments, the one that we use and the one that I know of allows you to pre-assign people to specific sides. So for example, my guild pre-assigned pretty much all of the melee to be on a specific side. So for example, I was assigned to the right side, whereas I was with, I believe, the Rogue and the Havoc Demon Hunter, as well as a tank, and a couple others as being force assigned right side, meaning I would almost, not even almost, I never got assigned left side during prog unless there was an issue with the note being pushed. And what this does is it lets you pre-position to where you'll generally be every time during the intermission. You don't have to react to your assignment that much. And it allows you to be much more calm when setting up and going into your Berserk and getting all of that shit off in a timely and efficient manner. It is also worth noting that for the RT note and most weak auras that are assigning positions, they will prioritize putting melee on the outside. This is why it is especially important that you have a pre-assigned side, because if you're swinging between left 1 and right 2, and you don't know which one you could possibly get, it creates a little bit of a hecticness at the start of I1 and is not really the best thing to have happen. So just try and make sure that you get a pre-assignment. All melee should be pre-assigned for this exact reason. Next thing is that you want to prepare for your Berserk as soon as possible. So basically, you're going to take the gate at the start to negate the knockup. Immediately when he's targetable, you're going to want to Tiger's Fury if you're a Night Elf, you want to Shadow Melt Rake the boss, Shred, Rip, Berserk Feral Frenzy, Bite, Convoke as fast, like do that entire sequence as fast as you can at the start of I1, just because doing so allows you to get your entire Berserk during the shield. The intermission lasts, if I remember correctly, somewhere between 25 to 30 seconds. So if you take too long setting up your Berserk, you could potentially not get your entire Berserk during the intermission shield, which is just an objective loss. So just make sure you're getting that Berserk set up ASAP. The general timing that you should be going for is that you should be convoking around a little bit before or a little bit after that, like general range of time. You should be trying to convoke around the time the first orb is hitting you, like the first wave of orbs. That is if you're getting your convoke off and everything else cleanly by that time, you are doing well. Next thing I want to note is, in order to make your Berserk setup clean and easy and less scary, is don't rush to grab your orb. You don't need to go out to grab the orb. You can let it walk right into you. There's no need to rush to grab your orb. Just take note of where it is, where it will path to hit the boss, and just stand in that line in the normal melee range. There's no need to go crazy about grabbing it. You should focus on hitting the boss and just making sure you don't die to the orb hits. That's it. Just hit the boss and be in line of the orb that is assigned to you. The last tip I have for I1 is your bark timing should be right before the second orb hits you. So pretty much melee will almost always have to soak 2 orbs, pretty much guaranteed, just because there's no backups in the middle that might accidentally soak it for you. You should bark right before the second orb hits you. That is because the second orb hits the hardest, and barking right before the hit will allow you to have the bark running, especially if you have the 4 seconds of increased bark duration. It will have your bark running through the entirety of the first blaze set that immediately follows the second orbs coming in. This is especially important because healing gets really sketchy around this point, and blaze is super deadly, especially if you get targeted by it right after soaking the second orb. Next, we're going to talk about P2. There's a few important tips in this phase, especially if you are assigned to doing a knock, which you likely are because there's not a super excess number of knocks in the game, even if you are melee. So the first one that I want to talk about is the angle that you Typhoon at. Depending on where you are, it's important that you Typhoon in a way that the person that's going to be going after you has an easy job knocking them closer to melee. If you're not careful with your Typhoon, you can actually end up spreading out the adds, which then requires 2 knocks. It's especially important that you plan based on who's assigned with you to be able to get the adds into melee quicker. Of course, depending on which ad set you are, this could be even easier, but in my case, as you'll see on the screen, I knock a little bit diagonally, not towards the middle of the boss. I knock a little bit diagonally so that the evoker that's assigned with me can then take those 2 and push them basically into melee range. Next up is you're going to need to press Mark of the Wild. I believe it is 4 or 5 times in this phase you should be pressing Mark of the Wild to buff the ads. This is because buffing the ads with Mark of the Wild, for some reason or another, makes them heal the tree for more. This is stupidly important, especially if you don't have min-maxy grips and rescues of the mobs into a Mirdrasil, which you should have anyway because it's a good backup in case you forget a Mark of the Wild. It is worth noting that 2 of these Mark of the Wilds are during pretty high activity times, right before and right during the first Colossus set. So it's imperative that, especially if you don't have other fail safes in place, that you do not forget these timings. If desired, I have some timers that I put in an RT note to help remind me to Mark of the Wild at certain times below that I will put in the description that you can borrow if you want them. But just remember, you want to buff basically every ad set, every healing ad set that spawns up to the second Colossus set. Once the second Colossus set is going, after those are dead, the sets that spawn after that don't really need to be buffed in order to ensure that you make it to the end of the phase. Next, I want to do a little tidbit about the Colossus phases. So at the start of Prog, when damage is not quite situated, cooldowns aren't exactly set up right, you're going to want to start by unloading your cooldowns, and by cooldowns I mean like Feral Frenzy, not Berserk. Do not ever Berserk the ads. By unloading your smaller cooldowns into the Burning Colossus and continue hitting it after any assigned knocks that you have to do through to the end of the intermission phase. This is because it is super important you kill the Burning Colossus before the second set of cage and cage break mechanics. Doing so drastically increases how easy the Colossus sets are. And then once you're comfortably killing the Burning Colossus, which may not happen for a while, or if you're lusting them, it might happen quite quickly if you're doing like a progression lust. At that point, you can start moving your damage to the Dark Colossus as much as you feel comfortable. For example, in my guild, what I ended up on was I start the set of Colossus by just unloading Feral Frenzy and Bites and single target everything into the Burning Colossus. And then as the ads are spawning and as the Feral Frenzy buff is falling off, I attempt to dot up the Dark Colossus and then I zip out to do my knock. Then after I'm done my knock, I come back into melee and I continue focusing on the Dark Colossus. And I trust that the people who are assigned to cooldowning the Colossi will finish off whatever remaining damage is there as I continue hard focusing into the Dark Colossus. This sort of min-max is relatively important because the faster you can kill the Dark Colossus, the faster you can switch back to the boss when it lands. So the quicker you can help kill the Dark Colossus, the better. And overkilling the Burning Colossus is good to start with, but when you're min-maxing boss damage, it's also important to do Dark Colossus damage. Next is that you want to keep a mental note of the right after the first set of Colossus, when the boss jumps down, this is your cooldown timing. Don't forget, don't delay. You want to make sure you're ready to go straight into this cooldown. When the boss lands and jumps to the tanks, immediately start setting up your dots unless the Colossus need help. Of course, focus the Colossus if you think it's high and might explode, but otherwise, hit the boss, set up your dots, make sure you have your blood talons, and just send your cooldowns. You want to be quick here so that you lose as little uptime as possible to the boss movement that's about to happen quickly after the first blaze set, as well as your GCDs while Mark of the Wilding the first set of healer ads that spawn after the first Colossus. And the last little tidbit that I want to add is that during the Colossus phases, towards the end of the Colossus phase especially, do not send a rip on a Colossus that doesn't need it. So if you see a Colossus at like 20% and dying at a good speed, you probably don't need to refresh your rip on that target. And instead, you probably want to bite to make sure it kills it quicker, and then otherwise save those combo points to rip the boss when it jumps to you. Don't overcommit on a Colossus that will easily die without you doing so when you have a target that will be coming out that is much higher priority. And lastly, we come to phase 3. So there's actually not many things I'm going to talk about here. This phase is pretty simple as a druid, but there are 2 core things you can do to drastically help the success of this phase. You are not a primary seed holder because druid in general is very squishy, so if you hold a red seed, you would get absolutely destroyed. Usually tank your melee, hold them first, and then you don't usually get the final set. And that's generally how that goes. So how you as a druid can contribute to this phase and this phase's success are 2 primary ways. The first, which I'm going to talk about initially, is your roar timings. So I talked about this towards the start of the video, but you're going to want to have 3 core roars here that you can get. And for progression's sake, the first 2 roars are the most important. These are roars on Tornadoes 1 and Tornadoes 3. There are 1 set of tornado per quadrant, as I call them, basically per devastating roar cast when you're dropping a seed and getting a shield. There's 1 set of tornadoes per section of the room that you're going to be standing. You want to pre-roar Tornadoes 1 and 3. You also want to position in a way that you're hitting as many of the healers who might be centralized towards the middle of the room. You want to hit as many of them as humanly possible because they are often the ones at most risk of not being able to make it to the side. One of the dumbest and most frustrating ways to wipe in this phase is a tornado killing people because they did not get far enough out. It is the dumbest way, and pre-roaring these tornadoes helps a lot. If you can get other movement speed boosts or time spirals on tornadoes 2 and 4, or if you want to roar 2 and 4 and then someone else does 1 and 3, those are all good. Now, if you do tornadoes 1 and 3, you can also, if you pre-roar tornado 3, you can do 1 final section where you can roar the 4th and final devastating roar from the boss. You'll need to pre-roar, as I just mentioned, you'll need to pre-roar both tornadoes beforehand so that it will be up in time for this roar at the end. This final roar is not super necessary. I actually forgot to do it on our kill, hilariously, but it helps a lot with repositioning and not getting pushed into the tornadoes at the very end of the fight. And the last thing I want to talk about is saving Tiger Dash. So you want to make sure that you have Tiger Dash for the sets that you don't have your own roar. So you as a Feral Druid plus roar can get out very far pretty easily. Now, it's super important that on the ones you don't have roar, you have Tiger Dash. This is Tornadoes 2 and 4. This is also assuming you don't have any other core movement speed boost to help you get out from other people in your raid. But one of the best things you can do for your raid is getting the tornadoes super far to the edge of the room. Like, having tornadoes be nowhere near the raid is one of the best things you can do for the survivability of especially the non-seed people in the raid. Just tornadoes, if you get hit by a tornado, that is a full-on one-shot. It does like 1.5 million base damage. There is no surviving that if you get hit unless you are using a hefty cooldown. And that is about it. That is all of the tips that I currently thought of over the course of making this video about how I personally improved my gameplay and how I did my job, or tried to do my job, on making the kill easier for my guild. And yeah, I hope you take away something from this. And honestly, Feral was a ton of fun on this fight, so hope you enjoy it.
Plan to kill. Watch the tornadoes. Just kill the boss now. There's nothing happening.
Immunes now! Immune! Kill!
Let's fucking
Holy shit!
Let's fucking go, boys!
Oh my god!
Let's fucking go!
Wait, so
Holy god, it was so long. Okay.
Any legendaries?
No Legos.
Oh!